I want to say that there is another kind of absolutism within the system which we have to avoid, and that is the absolutism of particular mechanisms and particular technologies. One of the advantages of a day like this is that we can explore a whole range of answers which come under that general framework of anaerobic digestion. We need to be very careful that we do not shut off any particular aspect of it. So often people try to pick winners. Governments have learned that that isn't good, but individuals have not so far learnt that at all. And we need therefore to recognise that there are many answers to these issues, that out of this kind of discussion we will begin to decide where we want to go, and we may well make mistakes as well as choose successful paths. That's part of being at the forefront. So we have today an essential element in the creation of a sustainable Britain. And sensibly, it is based on local sustainability in the east of England. I say sensibly because very often we create enormous barriers for ourselves by talking about the huge projects and the vast problems. I've always felt in international affairs it's like that. You look at China and India and you think, how do you deal with over 1 billion people? It all seems so big, and it's a relief to turn to Macedonia and realise you've got 1.5 million. It's a sort of effort that to understand the size that very often puts people off entirely. And when we talk about climate change and we talk about sustainability, I think sometimes we forget that it so overawes people that they feel there is nothing they themselves can do about it. They aren't able to make a big enough contribution. And so one has to bring these things down both to individual aspects and to localities. And we're doing both of those today. We're dealing with anaerobic digestion, and we're also dealing with it in the east of England in general and in Suffolk in particular. That's right, because that puts it into a context which everyone can understand and provides us with problems which are within the compass of everyone here. But we must not see it, of course, as an isolated element, which is why I began with some discussion of its place within the whole of the battle for sustainability and the battle against climate change. But in dealing with anaerobic digestion, we ought perhaps to concentrate on certain specific issues. The first is that we have never been properly organised to deal with this kind of waste. It's always been a kind of Cinderella. Even today, local authorities have found it much easier to collect garden compost than deal with food waste. It's just one of those things. And if I may say personally, it's one of those things. We try very hard to walk the walk. So we do compost, and we do divide our waste into various recycling packages. We try very hard to minimise the waste, and we spend a good deal of effort to remind people of the need for less packaging and less unnecessary attention to presentation. But we have a real problem when it comes to food waste, because we can deal with it here in Suffolk, but we can't deal with it in London. It just is very hard, and I have not yet convinced the family that it is perfectly reasonable to put the week's accumulated food waste in a sealed contents in a box and bring it up to Suffolk. This has so far been an impossibility. I admit it, it's our big issue. And I think it's quite an important issue to mention, because one of our basic concerns is how we deal with the product. Because the product is easy enough when you're dealing with the waste from a brewery or the cuttings from a major sandwich manufacturer, or dealing with one of the big farming groups who are preparing vegetables for supermarkets. You've got a centre where there is material and you can sort it. But we've got to think all the way through that this is something that in the end we have to provide so that all the waste that we use that can be properly dealt with in this way can be done. And that is a matter of organisation, which is still a very long way away from an effective solution. I say that in a county which has been better about it than many, but it's still not right. And the second thing I think about anaerobic digestion that we have to remember is that it's a very difficult concept for people to understand. Apart from the fact that it is spelt in an entirely ridiculous way, so that nobody gets it right, and apart too from the fact that it's a word that nobody really understands, it's also a process which involves considerations which are pretty far removed from the normal life of most ordinary people. And so one of the challenges I have for today is that out of it will come a much better language, a much better vocabulary, a much better way of explaining what you're trying to do, remembering that most people in Britain are scientifically illiterate. This is one of our problems. That's why we can't have GM foods. That's why we can't do a whole range of things that we ought to do, because people can be frightened very easily by anything that is even vaguely scientific. Because you can always find somebody who is the equivalent of the Jehovah's Witness to come and explain it to people in a way which will destroy any chance of it. Frankenstein Foods has destroyed for 2 generations an absolutely necessary scientific advance. And we are starving people because of the fact that we haven't been prepared to think seriously of the science which lies behind that ridiculous statement made by the chairman of Iceland, the food company. I say that because he deserves to be stuck with it the other way after having got the success the way he wanted it. Now, there is a real issue here. We have got to find ways about talking, telling the narrative of anaerobic digestion, which will enable people to see this as a valuable, worthwhile thing to support. And if we don't do that, it is extremely easy for people to find, and they will, find reasons why it can't be done. Not here, somewhere else, this is the wrong place, over there, all those arguments which are used, and they always find some fictitious bit of science in order to maintain the position which they wish to achieve. So let's speak about it better. And the other thing we have to do today, I think, is let's get our ducks in a row. I think we live in a world in which it's very easy to do one of 2 things. One is to say that somebody somewhere ought to do something about it. When I was a candidate and member of Parliament, I used to bang on doors, and you'd always find somebody who would say, well, you know, Mr. Gummer, somebody ought to do something about it. And as I had a fairly large majority, I used to say, well, what about you? Because it's an important point. Doing something about it starts with us. So the issue here, I think, is that this is the right place to start. Doing something about it starts with us, and all of us here have got a particular interest in it and obviously have accepted that part. But even so, we do tend to think that other people ought to set the framework which is satisfactory for us, that the government, county council, the district council, this or that organisation should do so. Well, yes, that is important, and we will hear in a moment or two what the government itself is intending to do to make the framework work. And of course, if we go back to my point about the internalisation of cost, the government has to do that, and the government has to do it nationally and internationally. But it is also true that we must not use that as an excuse for not making the developments ourselves, and it does involve investment, and it does involve taking risks. There is no risk-free success. That's one of the facts of life. It's something we should teach our children. It's something that our educational system has tried to pretend is not true, and we need to remind ourselves of that. But the second difficulty is that we do very often get so tied up with the particular bit of the system which we are concerned with that we forget the generality. So again today, I hope we will see not only what we can do, but also how what we do fits into the greater pattern. And the last thing I want to suggest about the arrangements today is that it will be very helpful to us if we think of this not only as a learning process for ourselves, but a teaching process for those who are seeking to promote anaerobic digestion. Part of the reason that the County Council has set this up, part of the reason that Climate East has supported it, and thanks to them we are able to have these two conferences, and part of the reason why we've had so much support from others is that people want to learn. Most of us are very aware of our ignorance, even if we have been involved in this issue for some time. It's a fascinating business, entirely new in the sense that we haven't been down here before, because in the past there were other ways of dealing with the waste we're talking about, most of which have now been eliminated because of the industrialisation, urbanisation, and also very directly because of the food safety standards which we now have. So this is a learning and a teaching process, and I hope what will come out of this will be not only a really valuable occasion for us, but that the results will enable us to include and involve a whole range of people outside who could make such a difference to what we're doing. So it's a very exciting day. It's one which I believe we can benefit enormously from, and I'm so pleased to see this absolutely unexpectedly large audience, so large that more chairs have had to be brought in. Now, I can tell you from a lifetime of politics and church affairs, what you do is to have a small room and you bring rather more people into it to make it look big. On this occasion we have a big room and we've still had the same effect. It's extremely valuable that this has happened, and I congratulate you all. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I do have to do a very boring thing. It'll be shorter than most people because I dislike these things entirely. If there's a large noise that sounds like a fire alarm, it is a fire alarm, and there are no scheduled fire alarms today, so if there is what you are supposed to do is to vacate the building by the nearest available exit, and most people here are intelligent enough to find that. There are lavatories, no doubt you found them, and there are also first aid attendees who will be able to look after anybody who finds the whole thing so shocking and surprising that they faint. Otherwise, you can find out for yourselves. May I then thank you all for coming and say that we are now going to have, I've got to just check because I hadn't found out beforehand whether he was here. Is Alex Page here? He is indeed here, so we can keep to the programme and say, I'm very pleased that we can start off by hearing what the coalition government's plans are for this whole area of anaerobic digestion. He's the head of the anaerobic digestion and composting team in DEFRA. I want to say one thing about that before he comes. It's this. We're very lucky to have in this area pretty unanimity across the political spectrum.